All right, welcome to this lesson. And in this lesson, we will be learning how to configure our Spring security. So let's begin by creating a new class. So go to new class. And this class will be called Web Security Configuration. All right, and we will be putting this class into a new package called configuration. All right, so once this class is created, we can begin development. So in order to tell Spring that we want this class to be a bean, we need to add an annotation like we always do. So for this one, for any type of configuration class, you want to use the annotation at configuration. All right, you can import that. And also, we want to enable web security on this project. So we need to add another annotation called enable web security. All right, you can import that. And this tells Spring that this is a configuration bean. This tells Spring to enable web security. Also, we need to extend this class and add a base class of web security configure adapter. So web security configure adapter. And then you can import that. All right. So now that we have that imported, we need to set up a way for our application to authenticate users. When we're authenticating a request, we need to have a method of doing that authentication. So we need to check the username and the password in our case. So the way we set this up is by using an Authentication Manager. So the Authentication Manager is what will actually hold the logic for authenticating our request. In order to do this, we need to create a new method that will set up our configuration for the authentication. So we do this by doing an AutoWire, and then we do public void configure global. All right. Then you can import that AutoWire at this moment. Next, we need to add the parameter. There's only one parameter, and that parameter is Authentication Manager Builder. And I would just name it off. So you can import that, and this is the only parameter for this class. Also, we need to add a throws declaration. So we're going to be, it throws an exception. Now on the inside of this method, we'll be configuring our Authentication Manager Builder. So this Authentication Manager Builder will set the configuration for the authentication. So we will use this Authentication Manager Builder object to set up in-memory authentication. So at this moment, we're not going to be using our database to set up our authentication. We're going to just hard code some values in so we can see how this works. And then we will add in our database further, because trying to do this all at one time is possible, but I would rather show you how everything is working so that when we do add the database portion, you could understand it better. So I wanted to separate them out. At this moment, we're just going to be adding in-memory authentication. So no database is being used at this moment. So we would do auth.in-memory authentication, and then we would do with user. So this is where we are setting our username. So this is the username that we put in when we want for our authentication. So with user and then dot password, this is where we set our password. So when it comes to this password, we need to use an encoder to encode our password. So if you try to just set it as a raw password, so say we are using password, this would not work. We would have to define an encoder for the password to work. So in order to do this, we need to add a bean for the password encoder for Spring to grab and use. So in order to do this, we will not be creating another class because there is a class that's already used for password encoders. So in order to create a bean out of an existing class, you would just need to use the @bean annotation. So I will show you how to do this using a method now. So what we would do is we would use our @bean annotation, and then we would define our method. So we want a method that returns a password encoder. So the password encoder is our class that we will be returning. So our bean will be a password encoder. So this bean is going to be a password encoder. And then we have our method name. We will just call it password encoder. And then we can import all of that. And then once we do this, we need to just return a new Bcrypt password encoder. All right, you can import that. So a Bcrypt password encoder is just a type of password encoder. So we return a new Bcrypt password encoder so we can have our password encoder to use in our Authentication Manager. So instead of just passing in a raw password here in this password method, we will pass in the password encoder and use the encode method of that class, and we will pass in this password. All right, so now we're encoding the password. So now we have a password, and then using this password encoder to encode that password. All right. And last but not least, we have to add the authorities. So authorities are nothing but roles. So each user can have different roles. So you can have like an admin role or an HR role or whatever roles you define in your application. So at this moment, we won't use any roles. So we will have just an empty array list. So you can define an empty array list by using the arrays class and then using as list, and then just don't put anything in as the parameters. This will create an empty list, and this is what we'll use for our authorities. So that is finished. So now we have our authentication configuration setup. So this will tell Spring how we want to authenticate. So whenever we need to authenticate a request, Spring will say, hey, is this user's name user? And is this user's password? And then if it is, then it will authenticate and say, yes, this is a user that can use this API. So in order to actually set up the authorization, then we have to add another configuration. So think of this as just the definition of how to authenticate, but it's not actually implementing that definition. It's just saying, hey, this is how we would implement. Now what we're about to configure is how to use that or when to use that. So we will be securing our endpoints by using this definition that we just set up. So in order to do this, we need to override a method from the web security configure adapter. So we use add override, and then this method is a protected method. Return a void, and it has a return type of void, and the method name is configure. So now that we have this, we need to add the one parameter that is needed, and that is HTTP security. And I will just call this HTTP, and then you can import that. Also, this method throws an exception, so let's add that. All right, so inside of this configure method, this is where we will configure our actual protection of our endpoints. So the way we will do this is it's possible to protect certain endpoints and not protect some, but we will just want to have a blanket protection. So we will protect all of our endpoints. So all endpoints need to be authenticated in order for you to use them. So we will start off by disabling CSRF. So we'll use this HTTP object and do .csrf and then .disable. So this would disable CSRF. If you're wondering what CSRF is, I will explain what it is in a future video. So at the moment, don't worry about it. Just go with the flow. All right, next we will be defining our authorization request. So when there's a request sent to our API, we want to authorize this request using this configuration that we're about to set up. So we do HTTP authorize request. See, there we go. Authorize request. Then we would do any request. So this is grabbing all of the requests, and we're saying authenticated. So when we do this, we're saying, hey, authorize the requests, any of the requests, and make sure that they're authenticated. All right. And then lastly, we need to add basic authentication. So we would do .and .http basic. All right. So I just put this on a new line just because you don't have to. You can actually keep it on the same line if you want to. I just did this for readability. So we're authorizing every request to this API. That's what this line is doing. This line is authorizing every request to the API. And this line is telling Spring, hey, we're using basic authentication. So this is all of the configuration that we need to do in order to set up web security. So this is the most basic implementation of web security that you can have. So we have in-memory authentication, where we are using the username of user and the password of password. We're not having any roles. Then we move down and we set up our HTTP security. So this will authorize our request for any request. So every request that comes, we will try to authorize it using this. And then we're telling Spring that we're using HTTP basic. So this is basic authentication that we're using to authenticate. All right, so this is it for the setting up our web security configuration. So this is all, and I will see you in the next lesson.